Any study of linguistics or history is going to be incomplete unless you take into account the cultural context that it's set within. So as we're growing up, we become naturally tuned in to certain things that are common to our culture. So that might be speaking a particular language, associating particular smells with Easter or Christmas or holidays or whatever, not wearing the same outfit as someone to a party, or being able to touch type. But there are other much less obvious things that are ingrained in us culturally that might not even seem optional to us. It might not even occur to us that these things are not universal. So the way we divide up colours, or the idea of having time to ourselves, or the idea of having a personality disconnected from everybody else's, or the idea that there is a past which is real but inaccessible because we've left it behind. Most of these things feel very intuitive to us, but they are culturally conditioned. And in anthropology, this is called somebody's cosmology, and that sounds like a very wishy-washy term, but it's an academic anthropological term, meaning the set of beliefs and the framework of understanding that people have about the world, the framework through which people experience the world. And it differs from person to person, but it differs a lot more from culture to culture. So a large-scale example of a cosmological difference might be the transition from life to death. So in one society, death might represent the end of somebody's existence in the world. So when somebody dies, you can't interact with them anymore, you can't access them anymore, and they don't have any more agency. So they can't take any new action, they can't have any new effect on the world. And that is closer to the kind of cosmology that most people in this part of Europe and North America have. And it will fluctuate a bit depending on religion, but even for people who do believe in an afterlife, believe the dead go to some sort of afterlife, that afterlife is often disconnected from the real world, and to all intents and purposes, dead people are no longer active agents in the world. And this change happens when the person biologically stops functioning, regardless of whether they have a funeral, regardless of anything else. The change from living person to dead person happens when their body stops functioning. On the other hand, you might have a society where death is a rite of passage in the same way that becoming an adult is a rite of passage. So it changes the person's status, but it doesn't stop them from existing as a social agent. They become an ancestor, but in the same way that children and adults have their role in society, so do ancestors. So they're active members of society on a day-to-day level. And something we would see as natural to them might be the result of an ancestor doing something. And in that society, a funerary ritual might be very important to complete the change from an alive person to a dead person. So without a funeral, that change might not completely happen. So those are two different ways of viewing death, and that's an extreme example using the idea of two very separate cultures. But there are also different attitudes to death and different reactions to death on a more personal level, and these are still cosmological differences, and they can exist within one culture. So let's say, for example, that when Sally was growing up, her family treated death one way, and when Mary was growing up, her family treated death a completely different way. And let's say that Sally and Mary both lose a parent at the same time in similar circumstances that they had a similar relationship with. Sally might go through all sorts of stages of grief. She might refuse to think about it. She might go through stages of despair. She might exhibit symptoms of depression. And that might go on for a few months in some form or other. And the funeral might be extremely traumatic for her. But on the other hand, Mary might have almost no emotional reaction. She might be upset for a few hours or a couple of days, but even that might be more of a cathartic release than anything resembling depression. So she's not denying it happened, she knows it happened, she can think and talk about the details throughout the whole process, but she's just genuinely not that upset about it. For her, the funeral might be a nice chance to see family. So to each person, the other person's response might be confusing, and this is a small-scale difference in cosmology that we might find in our own culture, but people on both ends of the spectrum might still fail to understand the other or not see the validity of the other, because their own response seems natural to them. And if confusion like that can occur within one society where, in theory, we can all talk to each other, we can sort these differences out, we can discuss these discrepancies and level them out, then it's going to be a big problem when talking about historical societies where we can't go and ask people, what did you think about this? How does this work in your mindset, in your worldview? So an example of that with respect to the Anglo-Saxons might be belief in things like elves. So the Anglo-Saxons, in their literature, they talk about elves really matter-of-factly, and they talk about them as if they're something that they're things that exist in the landscape. They're a very current thing. It's not like they existed in the past, but they don't exist anymore. They're a real thing that cause problems in people's day-to-day lives. And And this is a very real point of discrepancy between our culture and theirs, because we obviously don't believe in elves. So that raises the question, why did the Anglo-Saxons never clock that there are no such things as elves? Why did that never occur to them? You know, they were sensible people, they clearly knew what they were doing in other respects, so why did it never occur to anybody maybe elves aren't real? Well, I've framed that question in a deliberately modern-centric and Eurocentric way, and you could turn the question around and ask it from an Anglo-Saxon perspective. So how can we go through our whole lives never noticing that there are elves, and how do we rationalise a world where there aren't any elves? But reversing the question like that doesn't necessarily give us a satisfactory answer to our own question. So to us, it's obvious that there aren't elves. To them, it was obvious that there were elves. So what's the difference here? Well, our lack of belief in elves comes from a combination of things, and the two main things are, one, that nobody most of us have ever met claims to believe in elves or claims to have seen an elf. And two, more importantly, there is a culturally ingrained idea that elves aren't real, that elves don't exist. And those two things clearly feed into each other. So in the Anglo-Saxon period, people obviously interpreted certain things as evidence of elves. And we can tell that from texts. So most of the time text that shows up as medical problems that people thought were caused by elves. So Bald's Leech Book is a medical text from the 9th century, and that has a remedy for if a horse or another kind of domestic animal is struck with pain. And it says you have to take a dagger whose handle is made of ox horn, and it has to have 3 brass nails in it, and a certain religious incantation has to be carved into the handle. And you have to use that dagger to carve the mark of Jesus, presumably a cross, I don't know. It doesn't specify exactly what mark, into the animal's forehead and into its spine and into each of its 4 limbs, and the mark should be deep enough that the animal bleeds. And at the end it says, Su that ylva thehim siu this himmai dobote. If it's elves that are on it, this can cure it. And that's a very literal translation, so I've said on just because it uses the dative form him, which implies a preposition. But that doesn't mean the elves are physically on the horse like lice, it could be any preposition really, so on just translated best. So it's more likely that it just means the elves are pestering the horse, or whatever animal it is. So this implies that if an animal develops a sudden severe pain, that is evidence of elves. It's something that reinforces that belief in elves in a subconscious kind of way. And in a video I did a while ago with Hannah Chisholm, we talked about the idea of the causation of illnesses. And in order to understand this aspect of Anglo-Saxon behaviour, you have to really get into their heads and see the logic of it. So dragging a knife through a horse's skin is obviously not an anaesthetic thing to do. If anything, it's going to piss the horse off. But it will make the elves go away, and that will make the problem stop. And that kind of behaviour, which seems ritual to us but is medical from their perspective, or practical from their perspective, you can see that kind of preventative behaviour in rural traditions that lasted until very late on and still exist in some places. So the idea of leaving a pot of salt by the door, or leaving a horseshoe hanging on the door to stop certain spirits getting in, and the idea that there are unseen human-like things that can do damage to livestock and cause problems around the farm are very widespread and very old. And I think this is probably almost ancestral to that, this elf belief. And this was so ingrained in rural people's understanding of the world until quite recently that it clearly isn't Christianization that changed this. Whatever older tradition this stems from, this tradition isn't to do with religious allegiance, because religion was something that was layered onto people's lives later on. Elf beliefs are to do with people's fundamental understanding of the world and of how to navigate it. So rather than it being a Christianization thing, I think the disappearance in elf beliefs probably has more to do with the rise of the empiricist scientific paradigm that we now subscribe to. So elves don't fit into that because they can't be classified scientifically, they can't be empirically verified. So that doesn't fit into the way we now understand the world. And that can lead to us thinking that the Anglo-Saxons were stupid or confused, or that they were flailing around not really knowing what they were doing. But that's not how they saw things at the time. You know, at the time they weren't throwing things at a wall to see what stuck. They knew what they were doing. They had an internally consistent understanding of the world, and that's very important to understand when we're studying the Anglo-Saxons, because otherwise we can misinterpret their intentions, we can misinterpret their understanding. And the idea of elf belief kind of surviving Christianization leads on to another important thing, which I've covered before in some detail, but not in respect to the Anglo-Saxons, and that is the idea that the Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons was a shift from one overarching religion to another religion. And I think it's impossible to have a proper understanding of the process without realizing that's not how it was at the time. If the pre-Christian Anglo-Saxons were anything like pre-colonial people not subscribing to a major religion today, then their belief system was so tied into everything else they thought about the world that the word religion is not really appropriate to describe it. You couldn't tell the Anglo-Saxons, right, your pagan beliefs are wrong, this is the truth about the world. But yeah, you can't uproot the pagan beliefs without uprooting a load of very fundamental beliefs about the world along with them, in the same way as you can't pull a tree up without pulling a load of the soil up. So that's why Christianization took a load of quite strange forms. So there were places which were nominally Christian, but a load of seemingly pagan traditions carried on for ages. Certain things had to be illegalized that probably didn't actually stop for quite a while. And you have the names of Anglo-Saxon ancestral gods like Woden still appearing in genealogies, which were then kind of slotted into larger Christian genealogies. And that, again, I think goes to show the complexity of Anglo-Saxon genealogy and how it was much, much more rooted in beliefs and group associations than it was in anything genetic, which makes perfect sense because the Anglo-Saxons didn't have a concept of genetics. And there are terms in the Old English language that we can only really understand through a more anthropological lens. So there's the concept of the maud, which is similar to the concept of the soul in modern English, but it's not identical. And indeed, soul was a word in Old English which was used in a way that contrasted with maud, so they don't mean quite the same thing. And the only way we can really isolate the meanings of words like this is by looking at their distribution in text, and it's hard to tell whether maud is something that's constantly inside of somebody, or something that's fleeting and comes and goes at certain points, or varies in intensity. And it seems like the maud can be unruly, so it can have to be restrained by the person whose maud it is, which suggests that the maud isn't the same thing as the self, because otherwise the self wouldn't be able to restrain the maud. And I put someone's thesis in the description that goes into a lot more detail about that and explains it much better than I could. And also a book by my lecturer, which he's just released, about early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries. So because we have so many texts from the Anglo-Saxon period, we can tell quite a lot about their cosmology, although not as much as we'd be able to tell if we could do an ethnographic study on living Anglo-Saxons, obviously, which we can't. But that doesn't necessarily apply to the migration period before they were Christianized and before a lot of the texts were written. So for that period, we only really have archaeology to go on. And at least having an understanding of the cosmology of later Anglo-Saxons, or at least a fragmentary understanding of that cosmology, can help us to not make so many assumptions about pre-Christianization Anglo-Saxons when we're studying their archaeology. Thank you very much indeed for watching. I'm not going to have the short Anglo-Saxon film finished by Christmas, unfortunately, because of COVID factors. So in the meantime, I'll put out a mainly audio-based thing, tracking the progression from Middle to Modern English on a pretext that's hopefully a bit more immersive than what I've done with that kind of thing in the past. So that's the idea of a grandfather talking to his grandson, over a period of several generations, and the language changing along with that. And one last thing, my friend Josh Liesicke has a nice art Instagram and a shop where he has prints of his art, which I like very much indeed. So I'll leave a link to that in the description in case anybody else is interested in such things.